Good. So it's really nice to see a lot of people I haven't seen in a long time in a physical space. Yeah, thank you for coming, and thank you very much to Federica for the opportunity to do this. I'm really looking forward to your talks as well. And I'm going to present something that is very, very new for me, so I'm just really looking forward to your kind of feedback. So this is the first time I've presented this or really given it that much thought. And it comes from a kind of feeling of unease that I've had just lately. I think many of us have had some feeling of unease reading the news and the discussion of the coronavirus and conspiracy theories and all this stuff. There's many sources of unease potentially in the media. One thing that I've particularly noticed is that there's this tendency that we're seeing, on the one hand, to form all kinds of very kind of odd, seemingly odd beliefs. You know, that reptile people are taking over the American government. There was even a case a couple weeks ago I read about a murder. A man murdered his own two tiny children. He took them to Mexico and he murdered them because he was convinced that they had reptile DNA from their mother. And this, you know, this is just like, so on the one hand, what the heck is going on here? On the other hand, you know, we see a lot of people in academia, you know, like ourselves potentially, asking what the heck is going on here and saying, those people who believe those crazy things, what could be going on? And I think that's a perfectly legitimate question, but what I also see happening, I think, you know, is that it's almost becoming a situation where there are those people with those crazy beliefs and everybody else, including ourselves. And in the middle, there are people who either, you know, get lumped into one category, the reasonable people, or the other people, the crazy people. And I think it's not quite so easy to say that it's that straightforward. I think there's a lot of room in the middle to say, well, maybe some, you know, reptile people, okay, but some other things, like, you know, just calling, you know, certain you know, scientific consensus into question is in the history of science a perfectly legitimate thing to do. And there's a danger at the moment, I think, of lumping people who call any apparent scientific consensus into question along with the reptile people. And I slightly worry about that. And I want to just talk about this phenomenon of explaining certain beliefs in psychological terms. And the main point that I want to argue for is that actually belief in scientific stories, in kind of mainstream stories, can equally be explained in psychological terms. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but we also need to be aware of it when we go about putting other people who disagree with us into categories. So I'm calling this kind of tendency to believe sort of uncritically our own narrative, which even if it is the reasonable narrative can be believed uncritically. And I think that's a tendency that we need especially to be careful of in our contemporary media atmosphere, because I think it tends to create this dichotomy of us versus them, and it encourages us to be less critical of ourselves than we maybe should be, and maybe encourages epistemic arrogance. So that's the kind of big picture, and just it's very, very exploratory at this stage, so be nice. Okay, so just starting on the handout now. I'm going to talk, so my terminology is in terms of different kinds of narratives, and I'm just using this as a catch-all phrase for a kind of large-scale account or like a meaning-making belief system that serves, you know, potentially explanatory function. It could be anything from a myth to a scientific account that's very detailed in how it's worked out. And so here I want to distinguish just very loosely between expert narratives, which is just, you know, a narrative or an account that's believed or accepted by standardly acknowledged experts in the field. I'm thinking primarily of science, but it doesn't have to be, you know, science in the broader sense of Wissenschaft, you know, academia. It doesn't just have to be science, though. And that's kind of to be contrasted with anti-expert narratives. The prototype case is a conspiracy theory, right? So it's a narrative that differs from a kind of mainstream accepted narrative that's given by standardly acknowledged experts. And conspiracy theories are what we've seen a lot of, but anything that really calls into question any kind of accepted consensus counts here. Now, as I've said already, lots of social scientists and psychologists, we see this kind of literature burgeoning at the moment, where people try to explain belief in these kind of anti-expert narratives, whether it's lizard people or whether it's the idea that, well, maybe we need to call Pfizer and the other kind of vaccine developers into question a little bit more than the politicians might want us to, or stuff like that. We see a lot of people trying to explain contrarian beliefs of this kind in psychological terms. So, for example, desire for certainty. Conspiracy theories or kind of anti-expert narratives, science and the real world is complex and ambiguous, and that kind of naturally, because of our psychological mechanisms and our disposition to prefer black and white pictures, it makes us anxious and scared, so we seek certainty. And conspiracy theories and other anti-expert narratives offer a kind of certainty. It's the reptile people, or Pfizer is evil, or whatever. And so that's a kind of comforting kind of explanation that we can often latch onto in situations like in situations of social upheaval. There's also the idea that people who subscribe to anti-expert narratives are seeking to lessen their own sense of anxiety. Uncertainty creates cognitive dissonance, which makes us uncomfortable. Should I believe this or should I believe this? I feel a little scared, but rationality tells me I don't need to be scared, or rationality actually says I should be really scared, but I don't want to be scared. This certain explanation can just help us feel a little bit like the world is maybe more controllable. And so the idea, it might seem kind of crazy that thinking that reptile people are taking over the American government can lessen your anxiety, but if you're in a certain kind of worldview and mindset, and everybody around you is kind of like, it's us against the reptile people, we're going to win, this kind of group dynamic can make you feel a sense of solidarity, and like you're kind of within, among people who are with you and on your side. So I imagine that psychologically that's how it works. I wish there were some more psychologists in the room who could help us out with this. But in any case, grasping onto these very certain narratives is a way to kind of control a sense of anxiety. And similarly, it's a way to control a sense of existential threat. If you're kind of worried that the world isn't controllable because, coronavirus, where the heck did it come from? How can we control it? The governments don't know what they're doing. I don't know what I'm doing. The university administration doesn't know what they're doing. What are we going to do? The sense that, well, at least someone's in charge. It's the reptile people. It gives us a sense that, well, the world is controllable. Even if it's being controlled by the wrong people right now, it is controllable. And all that we have to do is wrest control from them. And the sense is this kind of big picture that actually the world is controllable. And so those are just some ways in which belief in anti-expert narratives have been postulated to have psychological explanations rather than epistemic explanations. It's not about the evidence, it's about how it makes us feel. So one important point, just to get on the table, is that these psychological mechanisms are commonly assumed in the literature, particularly in the psychology literature, not in the epistemic, in the philosophy literature so much, but in the psychology literature, they're assumed to be pernicious, really bad. Anxiety is a bad way to form beliefs. Wanting certainty is going to lead us astray. I just want to point out as a philosopher that that's a bit of a conclusion that people jump to who might not be so philosophically trained. In fact, psychological mechanisms are just part of how we form beliefs, and they can actually be epistemically helpful sometimes. I mean, if a desire for certainty can lead us to research more in order to really, go the extra mile and figure something out, and that's a good thing. Anxiety can make things salient to us, help us perceive things that really genuinely are dangerous. And that's an aspect of reality that we can then take on board. So that's an epistemic good thing. And similarly, if you're feeling existentially threatened, that could motivate you to really do your research and research things that you care about in order to make the world a better place for everyone. So these it's important to note that these psychological factors aren't necessarily epistemically bad. They can be epistemically good as well, and I think that's something that gets ignored in the literature. I want to, I already mentioned this, but I want to focus now on the worry that if this kind of us versus them dynamic in the academic literature is kind of continues and is not critically examined, a worry surfaces, at least for me, that if we focus primarily on psychologically explaining what could be motivating those people, that it can obscure two things that are actually really important for any inquirers to remain aware of. So first, this is A and B on the handout. First, the fact that expert narratives can be epistemically pernicious too, in the sense that first, scientists don't get everything right. Science is a great institution, and it's probably our best bet for getting things right, but it doesn't always get things right. It's done by people. And I'll come to some examples later of ways in which science has gone a little bit astray. But just to get the main structure on the table here is that so expert narratives can be, the narratives themselves, the accounts that we give, can lack justification for whatever reason. So the content can be problematic, but also we can believe perfectly good, justified narratives in epistemically problematic ways. And if we do that, so if I believe, the best theory because I've jumped to that conclusion, then that's likely to make me less, to make my further inquiries more problematic. It's likely to lead me astray in the future. Even if I believe the best theory, my further research, because I've gotten to that theory in a problematic way, I've jumped to that conclusion, or I've believed it because all my friends do, and the most distinguished professors believe it, that's probably going to mean that the future research that I do is not going to be so good, and it's going to lead me astray epistemically. And this can happen in science. This can happen in our best practices of inquiry. And I just worry that if we kind of focus on what those people out there are doing wrong, we're going to become a little bit self-satisfied about everything that we're probably doing right, and it's going to maybe distract us from the self-criticism that is essential to good science. So the second worry that I have about focusing primarily on psychological explanations of anti-expert narratives of kind of those people is that, well, actually, it's actually possible to believe an anti-expert narrative, or at least to take one seriously and inquire into it in a way that is actually epistemically illuminating. And if we kind of get into this us versus them mentality, we run the risk of ignoring that actually some of them might have some insights that we're overlooking. So those are two worries. And so the possible result of this kind of increasing us versus them kind of thing is, first of all, this in-group, out-group mentality that's just not conducive to scientific discourse or discourse on any topic. And I suggest that, in a very broad brushstroke kind of way, that this could encourage epistemic arrogance on our part. Right, so an epistemic arrogance, following Alessandro Tanesini, is just the propensity to overestimate our own epistemic strengths and to underestimate our own epistemic weaknesses. So we think we're a lot cleverer and better informed than we are, and we kind of ignore that actually we too are subject to certain psychological explanations for our beliefs. Like we too maybe are too quick to believe that Pfizer did everything right because we just want a solution to this problem. And it just is just, we're anxious at the prospect that actually maybe there's some question marks over Pfizer's methodology, for example. So these are, tendencies that anybody in a discipline of inquiry should really take seriously, I think. And we need a kind of empirical study to say that this tendency yields, this kind of us versus them dynamic yields this tendency to epistemic arrogance. And I'm not going to do an empirical study, but I think it's plausible enough to be worth our time. So I want to distinguish between, just to make things a little clearer, different kinds of people who can have these kinds of attitudes or beliefs towards expert or anti-expert narratives. So we have, on the one hand, people who are sort of lay people in a field. Like, I'm not a virologist or an epidemiologist. I just have to sort of go with whatever little philosophy of science knowledge I have and just sort of figure out what the heck is going on. And so I'm a lay person with respect to vaccines and things. And so we have a lot of lay people who are not experts, who are just trying to figure out on the basis of what experts think, what they should think themselves. And it's kind of clear how lay people can very easily be subject to these kinds of these kind of us versus them, or the experts versus everybody else. But experts too can also be subject to these tendencies, and I'll again, the examples are coming soon. But it's possible also for scientists to engage in groupthink, or to have a certain culture of we're not going to take those people seriously, or there's nothing to look at here. So I think lay people as well as experts, I'm calling them normal experts who are subject to the usual kind of cognitive biases and heuristics. I think this temptation is live for experts as well as lay people. And I'm going to, not now, but I think what we need eventually is an account of what makes an ideal expert, somebody who's self-critical in the appropriate way, so is not subject to these kinds of polarizing tendencies and biases. But for normal people, I think this is a worry. So just to make this a little more concrete, I'm going to give some specific examples, and primarily from the history of science, and that's where a lot of you in this room know a lot more about that than I do, so I would appreciate your input. But it's going to be an example of this phenomenon that I'm going to call science fundamentalism. And it's just a case in which the expert narrative that we're talking about is a scientific narrative, about vaccines or climate change. I'm going to illustrate some ways in which it's possible to believe, or at least accept or be open-minded towards an expert narrative or a mainstream narrative in a problematic way, by talking about 4 tendencies. So I'm just very provisional understanding of science fundamentalism on the next slide of the handout is it's overlooking the epistemically pernicious effects of psychological influence in science, and overestimating the epistemic qualities of the expert narratives that are justified by science. So I'm thinking of stuff, people say like, follow the science, which is a great thing to say, but we've got to understand what we're saying when we say follow the science. We're not saying take everything that Professor X says at face value uncritically. What we're saying is be on the lookout for Professor X to be a little bit self-critical, and don't be worried if he or she isn't quite as certain as we might want them to be. That's what following the science is about. And I think that this moniker "follow the science" isn't quite understood that way at the moment. So I want to illustrate 4 tendencies that I would associate with this idea of science fundamentalism, and say we should avoid these. So first is the tendency to assume that any minority opinion experts form belief in epistemically pernicious ways. The idea is that there's something close to a scientific consensus, or most scientists think something, and there are maybe a couple of outliers. Now, I think scientific consensus often is a strong indication that they're likely to be right, or that their theory is likely to be the most accurate or the most explanatorily powerful or whatever. And so consensus is a strong indication that there's something right here. But it's just not a foolproof indication that that is so. And we need disagreement and dissents to some extent. We need the mavericks to say, hey, wait a minute, there's this other idea that hasn't really been considered. Let's have a closer look at that. Now, of course, in the debate about the vaccine, the coronavirus, we're getting all kinds of people who are calling themselves experts, who are calling themselves mavericks. And when you look at their publication list, they haven't published anything since 1990, and that wasn't even in a relevant field. I'm not talking about people like that. I'm talking about people who are involved in the contemporary scientific discourse, who have every right to be at the table of experts, and who say, wait a minute, not so fast. It's pretty clear that groupthink phenomena do exist in science. I think anybody who's been in any kind of research group and who wants to get a publication or impress the professor or get a permanent job or anything is just very, very especially in disciplines not so much like philosophy, where people do work in groups and publish in groups. I think it's just very easy to have a kind of culture of us versus them, and taking and discounting somebody simply because they disagree with the consensus. And in the contemporary media discussions, we've seen that a lot. This is a big fault of science journalism, at least in my opinion, that they, I think, and possibly also for political reasons, in a social situation where it's really important to get people on board with the political agenda, there's often a big temptation to not give dissenting voices airtime, or to dismiss them as conspiracy theorists, or if, just for example, the BMJ whistleblower, the person who worked for Pfizer for a number of weeks in one of their labs, researching kind of the effect, in the preliminary trials for the vaccination, she kind of quit Pfizer and became a whistleblower. And there was an interview with her published in the BMJ, the British Medical Journal, and automatically in the Austrian press, there were lots of people saying, oh, well, that doesn't really matter so much. They were kind of belittling the importance of her statement, saying, well, that was just kind of one branch of Pfizer's huge enterprise that she was working for, and she only saw a very little bit. So this is just the first tendency of science fundamentalism, is just to sort of assume that anybody who is not part of the large consensus is doing something epistemically problematic, without really asking the question, maybe they have something going. So the second tendency is what I'm calling, or what I'm calling, Naomi Oreskes calls methodological fetishism. So this is in her book, Why Trust Science? The idea here is that, and here's where the example of continental drift comes in. She talks about that at great length. So the idea here is that I work with my methods, you work with your methods, and the Europeans have their methods, the Americans have their methods, and my methods are the ones that have borne fruit in my research in my life, so I'm going to go with them. So the idea is that results that are obtained by methods that I favor are the ones that I take more seriously. And this is another kind of common cognitive bias that people are susceptible to. Evidence that I've gathered is evidence that's more salient to me, that kind of weighs more heavily with me just because I've gathered it. A similar thing with the methods that we prefer. And here the example with the Europeans versus the Americans in the continental drift case is the idea, I think the Americans worked with a more kind of empirical method, from the bottom up, gathering evidence, seeing what might explain it, if I remember the case correctly. And the Europeans, as Naomi Oreskes described it, work with a more kind of theoretical, top-down, here's what our theories say, we have to go into the world and see how it corresponds with our theories. There was just a kind of talking past each other on the issue of this geological question. And the reason, as she analyzes it, seems to be that they just didn't like each other's methods, and there's a certain kind of closed-mindedness associated with thinking that the methods that you have been schooled in are the best ones. And you don't think this because you've been schooled in them, but that's basically, something that's unfamiliar to you is just, you're just naturally going to be more suspicious of it. And that's a tendency that I think, we can see a lot of. And I have a couple of examples that have occurred to me on the handout. So we see often, I think a lot of philosophers try to copy the methods of physics in a kind of methodology and terminological precision, which is really good. But I think we ignore that actually the subject matter of philosophy is not always quite subject to the same kind of precision that physics might be. And we overlook a lot of things, a lot of kind of gray areas and complexities in philosophy that we might otherwise be sensitized to if we don't just kind of make ourselves comfortable with the fact that that the subject matter of philosophy is often kind of difficult and perspectival. So I'm thinking here also of the debate that Noam Chomsky initiated with B.F. Skinner in the 1970s. So Skinner was kind of like, any methodology other than physics is really problematic. This idea that the psychology has, that people have internal states that motivate them, is just kind of ghost talk that comes from the mythological age, when we wanted to posit kind of like gods and demons to explain rain. This is just the same when we want to say that people have psychological states that motivate them to do things. That's no different from positive kind of gods and demons to explain the rain. Chomsky then accused Skinner of what we would today maybe call a methodological fetishism, saying, look, humans are complex. We cannot explain everything having to do with human beings by appeal to forces like socialization and DNA. There's just kind of something innate within human beings that we just cannot explain away. And we need a richer kind of methodology or explanation to kind of account for this. And that's maybe one example of methodological fetishism at work. I have a bit of a pet peeve as well about nutritional supplements, for example. So Justin McBrayer, in his recent book on fake news, he wants very laudably to argue that experts should be listened to, which is a perfectly reasonable argument to make. But then what he does is he goes and he says, look, these experts have written this very opinionated article in this medical journal, I forget which one, saying you should not take nutritional supplements because they're bunk, because they're just about selling supplements and they don't actually have any effect. Look at these couple of studies. And in my opinion anyway, this is another situation where methodological fetishism might be at work. The studies that were cited were randomized controlled trials, which is of course the gold standard in lots of areas, but they just ignored certain complexities that have to do with the human body in nutrition and how different body systems work together, saying, for example, the fact that there was no correlation discovered between intaking of vitamin C over a number of months and a longer lifespan. Well, why would you expect there to be, given the complexities that human lives involve and that that human systems involve? Vitamin C and all the various nutrients that you can take interact with each other in very complex ways that nutritional science doesn't even understand entirely. So postulating, saying that we're going to get some really important information on the basis of very simplistic correlations and saying, therefore, nutritional supplements are bunk because we have not discovered these correlations, I think is an example of methodological fetishism. I can say more about evidence-based medicine, which I think is a gold standard in lots of, so is the idea that you shouldn't prescribe any kind of medical procedure or medication unless it's been tested by the same kinds of randomized control trial standards that that have been then scientifically published in respected journals. I think in lots of cases, yeah, you need that standard to be respected. But in lots of other cases, I think insisting on that standard ignores a lot of the complexities that involve that can arise. I guess, for example, there's a method that's used to treat things like chronic fatigue syndrome that arguably, because of bias in the scientific literature and in Wikipedia, the Wikipedia page for this method has kind of been co-opted by people who think that it's scientific bunk and pseudoscience, and so there's a bit of a PR debate going on here, PR kind of conflict. It's very difficult for people who subscribe to this method to kind of get any traction in the academic literature. I've heard anecdotally also a lot of cases where people who have, and it's NLP based, and I don't know if you've heard about NLP, but that's got a very bad rap in lots of circles. However, it has been anecdotally shown to work, and there have been studies on it, but there are just a lot of cases anecdotally, and I'll get to anecdotes in a second, where papers have been rejected from journals or collected volumes because, oh, you can't mention NLP, that's bunk, that's pseudoscience. So there's a kind of self-perpetuating cycle where it's difficult for people in this community to prove that their methods can have any results, because there's a bias in the scientific community against accepting any results that prove that. They have to kind of name them in other ways. So these things do arise in science, and the next one, and I just mentioned, is anecdotal evidence. I mention anecdotal evidence favorably, and of course a lot of people, rightly, to a large extent, say, oh, anecdotal evidence, we can't rely on that. It's just stories that people tell. There's nothing systematic about it. We have to be very careful, when we rely on anything that's not systematized or studied in a kind of, scientifically respectable way. And yeah, that's certainly right. However, studies have to start somewhere. How do you know that something is worth studying unless you get a couple of anecdotes that make you think, hey, maybe there's something to this after all. You know, maybe we should do a study on bias in the psychology community against NLP, for example, neuro-linguistic programming. That's what that stands for. Maybe we should do a study of that. Maybe we should do a study. Lots of people really claim to have had their health turned around by taking a certain high quality level of nutritional supplements for a while. Maybe we should actually study that in a little more detail. And it's not just about taking vitamin C, it's about the brand you take, it's about whether it contains fillers or other problematic things like sand as fillers or whatever, the quality matters here. Maybe we should look closely into this and not just dismiss all of these reports of people who have allegedly benefited from taking nutritional supplements as anecdotal evidence. We've got to start studies somewhere. And the problem is that there are just so many more studies that need to be done than people who are willing to pay for them and people who are able to do them and people who are competent to do them. And so simply dismissing anything that we call anecdotal, any narrative, as unscientific or not worth taking seriously, I think is another example of scientific fundamentalism. Naomi Oreskes, in her book, gives another really good example in which doctors and the medical community routinely dismissed women's reports of depression correlating with taking hormonal birth control, and many years. And it's just and she says that sexism probably had something to do with this, and just in general in the medical community, women's health has been very understudied compared to men's health. And she says, well, actually, if we look at it more closely, there is actually a really good case to be made that hormonal birth control does cause, if not very, correlate very strongly with incidence of depression. And if we didn't take those anecdotes seriously, if somebody didn't say, hey, we need to systematize this, it would never have been done. So that's just another example. It's just saying, hey, that's just anecdotal, we shouldn't take it seriously, I think is another danger here. Finally, and I'll talk about this one more briefly because I think there's been a lot done on this, is there's a tendency in our very kind of polarized situation, where it's, us, the rational ones who are scientific, and we explore the psychological impact of certain factors like anxiety on their beliefs, but not our own. There's a tendency to ignore the same sociological and psychological factors as they might impact our own beliefs, our own, scientific rational beliefs. And so if I think good scientists, real scientists, proper ideal experts don't do this. Ideal experts say, hey, I really should declare my funding sources because I know that could have an impact on my own thinking, even at the unconscious level. I don't think my pharmaceutical company funding sources influence my thinking, but I also recognize that if it did influence me, I probably wouldn't be aware of that. So ideal experts, good experts, are aware of these kinds of things. They're aware of the things that they might be overlooking, and they're not afraid to say, hey, let's have a conversation about this. Let's put in place as many safeguards as we can, and let's be open to the idea that sociological, psychological influences have impacted my thinking. There's a tendency, in the mainstream media anyway, to really worry, or to really kind of back off from this kind of self-criticism, and to say, hey, wait a minute, you are calling the pharmaceutical companies' research into question at a time when we have a global pandemic. What's wrong with you? Actually, it's a really difficult question how we can do this kind of thing without getting the public to panic. But good science and good inquiry requires really taking these kinds of influences seriously. And possibly even some people will panic less because they think that their concerns are being taken seriously. So I don't have a practical solution for this, but I think that anyway, I want to point out that a danger of what I'm calling scientific fundamentalism is to ignore these sociological factors. So conspiracy theorists, of the lizard people variety, they will say, hey, science, they're just in on the conspiracy. They're in cahoots with the lizard people. And you know, that is a kind of fundamentalism too. But there's a similar parallel kind of fundamentalism that we can get among experts and scientists that is exactly of the same structure. It's just saying, you know, all of those people are, you know, those lizard people or those people who, you know, are calling into question our scientific consensus in any way are just beyond the pale, and we're the rational ones. So I see this happening in both camps, and I think we need to just be aware of that. So, right. So I'm at number 5 now, and yeah, so I think, yeah, I just want to point out in conclusion that the very, you know, more specifically, the very same psychological and sociological factors that influence those people to believe conspiracy theories and anti-expert narratives can come into play with believing expert narratives, whether it's lay people or experts themselves, so a desire for certainty. I personally would much rather, you know, just in the recent pandemic example, I would much rather that I had perfect certainty about Pfizer's methodology and had no doubts whatsoever about how cleanly they investigated adverse results to their jab and whatnot. I would so much rather that. I would so much rather be certain. And so that might motivate me to believe more confidently in the scientific, you know, consensus as it's being represented in the mainstream media than I otherwise might. And you know, the idea that the world is, you know, the idea that scientists really can't solve all of our problems makes me anxious. So that might incline me to trust, you know, whatever shards of scientific consensus there is much more than I ought to. And maybe that's, you know, my proclivity, but I see the same psychological tendencies at work in myself, just going in the other direction. And you know, feeling of existential threat. You know, how can we best combat this existential threat other than by our best science? So let's, you know, put all of our eggs in that basket. And similarly, as I've also talked about, you know, there's groupthink, and there are also the well-known biases and heuristics that, you know, the history of science is well aware of. And so yeah, the next step in this project is going to be to come up with an account of what ideal belief in expert narratives looks like. You know, as opposed to, you know, just lay people or normal experts, what kinds of attitudes and dispositions we need to really get on board with this worry and take it seriously. So that's it. Thank you for your attention.